All right. So this particular week, I'm calling it Lesson 3 on Hardship. Right. So the first couple weeks we talked about, how do you make a decision to build, and then how do you make all those financial decisions about what kind of build and when are you ready and all that. But as you might imagine, in the process of a big project, you run into some hardships. And so how you process that, I think, is just something you have to do, but also it's one of the big opportunities to grow, right? And to learn and to make it a positive experience. So as you might imagine, a lot of the hardship comes from working with contractors. That was one of the big things. You have to work with a lot of other people, and other people are often the source of our hardships, right? This was not actually one of our contractors. I just thought this was pretty funny. Look, and the guy obviously doesn't have things straight. But I did hire a handyman to help with little things that the big contractors just wouldn't do. And I gave him a list of 8 things to do. But then he said he was done, and I looked, and he only did jobs 1, 3, 5, and 7 off the list. And I asked him about it, and it turns out he only does odd jobs. So, okay, that's right. Obviously that was an attempt at a joke. Thank you. I got one real laugh out of it, and the rest of you were just being polite, and I appreciate it. But here's a lot of there's a lot of encouragement in the New Testament in the Bible about going through hardship. But in preparation for this, when you read them, a lot of the things that we read, like, in this world you will have trouble, right? But you may know the rest of that, right? Take heart, I've overcome the world. But when you read it, a lot of them really seem to be talking about people who are going through particular spiritual hardships of standing up for the gospel, proclaiming faith in Jesus, spreading the gospel, the persecution that they experience. But most of us, I would say that most of the hardships we experience in life are not that kind. And some of you might actually experience some persecution for standing up for the gospel, but a lot of the things that are tough on us aren't exactly that. So my question for you, is Jesus talking about the kind of trouble we might have when we're building a house or raising kids or working at a place of employment? When he gives us these encouraging words, I wonder what your thoughts are, if you guys have thought about that much. What encouragement is there in the New Testament, or when there is encouragement? Is it applied to those situations?
Yeah, those situations are the things that make us stray the most. Like, there's just tiny little frustrations that build up, and your mentality is not necessarily biblically grounded.
That's a polite way of putting it. So a lot of our temptations to fall away from the faith aren't somebody directly saying you should fall away from the faith.
Yeah.
It's another thing saying you should be discouraged, you should adopt a hateful attitude, you should be unthankful.
Things that distance us, and then when something big comes up, we're not ready for it spiritually because we've been distanced.
Okay. So it's not as direct, it's more subtle, but in some sense maybe it's more dangerous when it's more subtle, right? When the devil says you should reject God and say you're not a Christian, it's kind of pretty obvious and easy to say, no, I'm a Christian. When the devil says you should be really mad at God because this didn't turn out the way you expected it, it's somehow more subtle, maybe even more important to have the Bible in our mind when that happens. Okay, well, let me just go through. So because of the type of study this is, a lot of it's just going to be stories. We'll just have some fun. We'll tell a few of the stories. But then it brings up the situations where the word might apply. And don't worry, we'll get to a place where we're going to look at the word together. So hardships come in various kinds. This might have been kind of a small hardship, but this is the barn we built first as kind of a laydown area for the stuff as we were building the house. And that's my wife on the right, standing next to our first post on our first building on the new house. But I tell you what, it was a hardship getting those posts in the ground. It's a pole building. And to dig those, I had to go out and we found the perfect place to put the barn. And at first I got one of those plunge augers from you rent, and it's got a spiraling bit, but it's not the kind that would have broken my shoulders. And you plunge down and come back up. And I was doing it, and the wheels were getting stuck in the mud. It was a wet August. And when I came back up, pulling it out of the muck would sort of slide back in. and it just stunk to high heaven. And it was just so foul. It was so hot, and I could smell the disgusting smell of it. So I ended up renting a mini excavator and just digging a huge hole so that I could get a base, put the pole in the base, and filled it back in. So it turns out it was actually smelling bad and hard to work with because we were building it on the side of the old drain fields from the septic system that was defunct. So yeah, we were building right on poop. So that was a hardship of a kind, maybe due to some poor planning, but what were you going to do? It had to be there anyway. Maybe it's better that I didn't realize it. Not everybody was really bothered by the conditions. That's our husky, Colby. For about a year during the build, because things went slowly, it's another hardship, it was just constant mud everywhere, on the construction site, all mud, which was a constant irritation to my wife. She's like, I can't wait until we get some of this paved. But Colby somehow didn't mind. He's kind of misses it, I think. He's like, where's my mud? So this is a picture. Our house is built into the side of a slope. So it's got a walkout basement, you might say. So here's the slope side of our walkout basement. And on the right side, you can see that's all insulated wall. That's called insulated concrete form, which is like Lego blocks of styrofoam, and then you pour the concrete in the middle. Super awesome. But then we went to the old style cinder blocks on the left, and the reason is that part is the root cellar. And we wanted humidity, and we wanted the constant 55-degree temperature that comes from that. So that's my wife's root cellar, where we're theoretically going to store all the vegetables that we're going to grow someday. Our vegetables aren't growing so well right now. We sent some soil samples off to Penn State. But one of the things when you build a root cellar is, and you can maybe see it, between the two people, there's a little opening at the bottom, a little pipe opening you might see. So this is a ventilation shaft because you don't want the ethylene gas building up that makes your vegetables become overripe and all that. So you want fresh air coming in, and you want the pipe to start way over here, go down and come in sideways, so it becomes conditioned to that constant 55 degrees that the ground is. And then you have a place where it comes out the top, and you get that circulation of air coming through. Really cool concept. So where did the hardship come in? Well, the pipes, which actually I think is kind of clever, the pipes come out underneath our porch where there's a little crawl space underneath, so we don't get snow and rain going in the pipes. But when we checked, after all the porch was built and everything, there was some water accumulating in the pipes. And so we checked, and the pipes actually slightly ran downhill the wrong direction. They were installed directly. So I don't know if you can tell, but all of these boards are labeled. And I labeled them so I could put them back in the correct order after I completely tore apart the porch, dug down 10 feet, lifted the pipe like 4 inches on one end, and then put it all back together. So getting things wrong the first time is very painful. And as you mentioned, maybe not that big a deal. The pipe was 4 inches too low. It seemed like it was a trial of my faith to me. I was quite tempted to be irritated.
Water was drained into the root cellar?
Well, there's humidity, and as the humid air comes down, it cools to 55 degrees, which you want, but that means the water's going to condense out of the air to the sides of the pipe, which is fine if it drains the correct way, because it'll just drain in, hit the gravel, and dissipate into the ground. But when it goes the wrong direction, water fills up, it was going to become full of mold, and then the whole place would be like a toxic mold trap or something. It was like, we can't have that. And I was thinking, what else could we do? It's like, nothing. We just have to dig it out. I ended up putting a T at the end and a gravel pit on the other end too, so the condensation can run down there as well, which is probably what should have been the design to begin with. So, good planning is important. Here's another hardship my wife really didn't like. So, to make the place really watertight and everything was really important. We built what's called a pretty good house, which I'll get to next week. It's actually a technical term, believe it or not. Which means it has to be super tight, and you've got a separate energy recovery ventilation, and you have to waterproof everything. So we were told by our contractor, you have to use this really sticky pink air dam, and the red flashing, super sticky, ruins all your clothes. And because she wasn't as skilled with the hammer and saw and everything, it became my wife's job. And so she really didn't like doing that. So just having to do this hard job everywhere because you couldn't really hire anybody to do it. Nobody wants to be hired to do that stuff. Like we found that out during the build. Part of the hardship was in the environment at the time, you could barely get contractors to call you back. And they certainly were only willing to come in and do like one day of a big job. And all the little details are like, you can take care of that. So we had to learn to do lots of things and take care of it ourselves. Hardships came in other forms too. As you know, bats carry rabies, so you don't want to see them in your house. And I'm not sure, I think this bat may have been rabid because it was acting really funky. So I had a really great friend who's always prepared and actually had a net in their car when we discovered this bat. And so captured the bat and went to release it in the wild. He's also very brave. Took a photo of the bat and we took it outside. So, yeah, it was a little scary. And so then we can get to the contractors. So you guys might recognize this. This is anybody recognize this? What this is in particular? Yeah, it's electrical drawings where you have to know all the little symbols. You know, this is a 1-gang outlet, a 2-gang. This one's got 3-way switching, what controls the lights and fan, all that stuff. So I took one of those big, and I forget how big they are, I don't know, 17 by 24, whatever, the size they print out of your blueprints.
24 by 36.
There you go, 24 by 36. I had 2 of them, the first floor and the second floor, and I studied what these symbols were, and I went through and marked every outlet, every box, every switch the way I wanted it. And we brought in our first contractor who was our plumbing and electrical together and had a big meeting. We went over all this and they got started and they got in like a couple pipes and then they ghosted us. Like this was actually our general contractor's friend. Ghosted our friend. This was actually pretty common at this time. I don't know if it's still this bad, but it was really hard to get contractors to call you back. So he also took my plans. I'm like, can I at least have the plans? So we had to hire another electrical contractor who at least stuck with us, but they weren't so reliable all the time. So this is how goofy Leslie and my friend John got one night because we were having an inspection the next day and the electrical wasn't all ready for inspection. So we stayed up till nearly midnight going around and doing all the stuff that was left over ourselves and got kind of goofy with the electrical wire. That was one of the big hardships was the electrical contractor. In fact, I remember, I'm going to tell a story about my wife, makes her look good, but we had to have a series of inspections in order for them to release the construction money. So we got a construction loan for a lot of this. And the construction loan people give you like a quarter of the money every time you meet a certain landmark. And you had to have an inspection, tell the bank that you're where you're supposed to be. So we had this big inspection coming up to give us the money that we really needed to get the next step done. And all this stuff wasn't done. And so we called a few times, tried to explain it to them. They sent one guy out who literally spent half the day working on our kitchen island. And he spent a lot of time putting in an outlet for the garbage disposal, which we weren't installing a garbage disposal, so we didn't even need that. So my wife calls us like, this guy's not even doing the stuff that needs to be done. We're desperate, please, you gotta help us. So they did end up sending 4 people out the next morning to help finish up all the stuff. But the inspector comes at around noon, and the guys are like, and so my wife turns on all her charm, gets the guy some coffee, sits down. Fortunately, he was a talker. And it turns out he does solar too and does his own solar. So she's like, tell me more about solar. That's fascinating. And so she gets him monologuing like some villain from a superhero movie. And finally at around 12:30, the guys are like, and she's like, good, well, you ready to start the inspection? Let's go. And so we passed. So that was good. Very creative of my wife. So all of these little hardships, and there are more serious hardships we'll get to in a minute, but they bring up the idea, like, what biblical advice is there for how to prepare for or deal with hardships? This is where I wanted to stop and look into the Bible together, and let's see what we can figure out together. It's some good advice to take away. So if you guys want to open up, you can see these are all from Proverbs. And what I'd like is for somebody to volunteer to read a proverb, and if you would, maybe give us your thought about what it might say, and the whole class gets to help, right? What does it say in regards to hardships? So maybe I'll write up here. The first one's Proverbs 15:15. So who can read that for us?
All the days of the oppressed are wretched, but the cheerful heart has a continual feast.
Okay. All right. All the days of the oppressed are wretched, but the cheerful heart has a continual feast. What does that tell us about hardship?
Perspective.
Perspective. Tell me more. I like that word.
Just, I don't know, when you go through hard times, if you don't have the Lord, a lot of people don't know how to handle something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have the Lord, it just changes your focus that, trying to learn something, what's he trying to teach me, or finding good in bad and stuff like that.
Right. Because you could take that proverb on its face and it would say something that we all think is obviously not true, right? All the days of the oppressed are wretched. Meaning, like, if you're oppressed, everything's wrong for you. It will literally go wrong. But the cheerful heart has a continual feast, meaning people who are cheerful, everything goes right for them. But we know that's not true. And it's not that things literally go all wrong for the people with the wrong perspective and things go all right for the people with the right perspective. It's that the people with the wrong perspective will only see the things that are going wrong, and they will be miserable because of it. And the cheerful heart has learned to be thankful in every situation, and therefore it's like life is like a continual feast for them.
Yeah.
And so it's not your circumstances that determine whether you come to the job site every day with joy. It's your perspective that determines whether you show up with joy. Right? It's powerful. All right. What about Proverbs 17:17? I'm going to put perspective up here. That's a good word.
A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity.
There's that word adversity, so I'm going to say that's our tie into hardship. Right? So what does this tell us about hardship or adversity?
I think a lot of times people find friends that kind of agree with them all the time,
Mm-hmm.
so it kind of makes them feel good type stuff. And then if you think of like a brother or sister, they tell you the hard truth sometimes
Mhm.
that challenges you, and they're usually the opposite of you.
Mm-hmm.
So not many brothers are the same, so then they butt heads and get into conflict, and so it usually causes you to grow in an area that maybe you didn't want to grow.
So there's another proverb that says, right, an enemy multiplies kisses, but wounds from a friend can be trusted. So that's one way in which a brother really truly shows up during hardship is they'll tell you the hard truth you need to get through the hardship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But maybe a half a step before that is just they show up at all during the hardship. They got to show up telling you the truth, which is, I think you jumped to like, that's why it's so good to have a tight friend. But you can sort of tell who your tight friends are because they are the ones who are there during adversity and hardship,
That's kind of how I read it, yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of read it like a brother is born out of adversity, and I'd be interested to study the original language, the word for there, but a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born out of a time of adversity, if you read it like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we could probably think of stories in our own lives when maybe even somebody we didn't expect was such a good friend, but they were there in adversity, and we're like, you see their true mettle, their true commitment, And also just sort of, I think it's built in to say, and you know what, you need that, right? So we ought to be looking for those friends in times of adversity, not meant to go through them alone. There's something about adversity that is meant to bring people together, bring out that friendship. So don't despise adversity, but say, okay, how is this going to help me grow closer to people, get through things together? And I don't know if this is true for everybody. It's kind of true for me. I suspect it's true for a lot of us Americans. I like being the guy who's there for somebody else. Yeah, buddy, I'll be there. You know, I'm your hero. But I don't as much look forward to being the guy who's looking for a hero. You know, maybe I don't call somebody for help because I'm a little embarrassed, or I'd rather just do it my way. But I think that building a house is one of the good things about it being such a big project. Is that you kind of have no choice. You get to places where you're like, yeah, I have, no, it doesn't matter how full of pride I am, I really need help here. So it makes you reach out. And we talked about early on, but I didn't say it this time. Building a house is just one kind of activity that requires a lot of your time and resources, right? But the lessons you learn from building a house should apply to other projects you do. All the other things you need to do in life. As buying a car, building a business, raising a family, you know, lots of things. So lean on your friends. Proverbs 17. You'll both want to lean on them, and you'll find out who your friends are during times of adversity. Okay. Proverbs 18:14.
The human spirit can endure in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear?
What is this proverb touching on? Yeah.
I think maybe it kind of speaks, at least to me, it kind of speaks to just like having hope, like a crushed spirit. Like, I feel like as long as we have hope in Jesus Christ, just knowing like this earth is not our home, like there's always going to be bad stuff that's happening, but we always have hope beyond what's right here, right now. And so, you know, can our spirit, you can have moments of feeling kind of defeated, but overall, I think we always can kind of pull ourselves out of that by having like an internal perspective. And so we always have hope regardless of circumstances on this earth. It's just remembering that in those times.
Yeah. In that verse, it's not the severity of the sickness that matters, right? It's more the condition of your heart. Are you full of hope? Right? So that it's not how difficult your circumstances are, but how firm and secure your hope is that really makes a difference in your life. And so practical application, when things start to get rough, when we maybe start bickering and fighting, right? We tend to look at and say, what? Oh, so terrible. The banks, the contractors that, or, you know, oh, I made these stupid mistakes. I can't forgive myself. You start hearing yourself say that. You should diagnose, it's not that the problems are worse than they used to be. It's that my heart needs some medicine, some spiritual medicine, right? And maybe instead of looking at your plans again or sitting down with your contractors, maybe you need to spend a little time in the Word or encouraging one another or praying. Like, so when things look like they're going bad, think first, is my heart right? Before you think, are the circumstances right? And I think that's something you learn. Really important. So kind of say problem solving starts with hope, right? You got to have hope first, or you're not going to make progress. You're not going to get to your solutions. Okay. Proverbs 24:10.
If you fail strength is too small.
That's kind of harsh. I think we're meant to, with Proverbs, kind of say it in the reverse, right? Like a measure of your strength is whether you cave in under pressure, right? So you can see the positive of that as well. And I think we're meant to do that with Proverbs, playing forward and playing backwards. And so I don't know exactly what I was looking for with this one, but I think that part of the reason we do hard things is to test our mettle. And testing our mettle and growing and knowing that we've got what it takes to make it through hard times. I think that's just part of the human condition. We all want that. In fact, there's biblical language all over that, right? Like it often compares our spiritual walk to a battle or a race. He's like, congratulations, you withstood the test. And so it's okay if life feels like a test, I guess, right? And just pray for strength. And it's not that you want an easy time. It's that you want the strength to make it through. That's what we really want.
The word you're looking for here could be steadfast.
Steadfast. Maybe rather than praying for an easy time, you could pray to be steadfast. It seems like that's what the value is, right? So don't take away my impression, make me steadfast. It's kind of odd, maybe not intuitive, and I know it's not cultural. So our culture runs away from suffering and from difficulties. Give me the easy way, man. But it's just, for some reason, not the way we're built to thrive and to prosper. So, okay. Proverbs 27:12.
The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple will keep going and pay the penalty.
I see it talking about wisdom.
Yeah. Wisdom to do what?
Just that you can foresee something isn't going to end well or not be good, and then if you're passive, and then you didn't see ahead, you shouldn't have done that, or just have to be alert and focus and use your wisdom with everything.
See, Proverbs is always doing that to us. It tells us opposite things. So in Proverbs 24:10, I just told you shouldn't pray for an easy time. You should be steadfast and keep going. And then Proverbs 27:12 says, sometimes it's wise just to stop before you keep going in something that's very bad. And the word wisdom is perfect because wisdom is literally the ability to tell the difference between those two paths, right? Wisdom is the ability to tell the difference between two paths that can be legitimate given the circumstances. So it's not always right to just say, I'm going to keep doing this, just make me steadfast. Sometimes, right, we're supposed to say, oh, this is hard because it's a dumb idea. And so you have to have the humility to stop.
Discernment as well.
Discernment, that's another great word. So, and Proverbs doesn't let us off the hook that way. It's not the 10 steps to have a perfect house built. We just don't get off that easy. Which is why God is always and very directly telling us to pray for wisdom, because we have to have wisdom and discernment. When do I persevere and ask for hope and strength, and when do I abandon a bad idea? So get a lot of practice at that, building a house. Okay. Good, thank you. You guys gave some great thoughts here. So let me go on and tell you a little bit more about some of the hardships we experienced. So I mentioned the electrical guys, they come up over and over again. The inspector said you have to have an outlet every X number of feet on the wall. And we're like, well, it's a stone wall and it's stairway. It doesn't make any sense. They're like, no, you put it on the railing. And I'm like, you don't need it on the railing. We've got a floor one. There was literally a floor one 3 feet away in the middle of the room. And he's like, it's code. Well, my electrical guy said, there's no way we're putting an electrical outlet in a metal. We just don't do that. So I had to figure out how to do it myself. And cut a hole, put wire in from the floor through the bottom, and make an outlet. But I did it there instead of on the floor. He said, well, you can put it on the floor right next to it. But I thought, well, that will be ugly. And putting it on the post will at least can conceal it. And I think it actually came off. In fact, I never noticed it. I bet people who visited my house have never noticed there's an electrical outlet there. But unfortunately, I didn't have the wisdom to use the right tool. All you guys probably now looking at me like, oh, you cut that hole, you probably did an oscillating tool, right? I'm like, yeah, eventually I used an oscillating tool, but first I tried to use a jigsaw. And when I did the jigsaw, it came out too far, hit the metal post, bounced up, and cut my thumb. And
The duct tape Band-Aid, I like it.
well, that was the other injury. So these are actually two separate thumb injuries that I did. So injury is part of the hardship. The other one was, and this is really scary. I've got a table saw. I've had a table saw for 23 years. Just got a new one. I upgraded to a cabinet saw. Oh, it's so nice. And I could only afford the 2 horsepower one, but they accidentally sent me the 3 horsepower one. I'm like, yes. Anyway, so I had made a jig because I needed to cut these special angles so I could have a piece of wood inside the posts to stick the cedar top on, whatever. So I had this jig, and always a table saw. I'm always very careful, and before every cut, even on repeated cuts, I look and I say, how am I going to cut my finger off? Let's not do that, right? And I've been very good all these years, no table saw injuries, but it was getting near the end of the day. I needed to get this done, and so I'm doing my jig. And the one time when I come back and I put the new piece in, instead of holding it like this, as the jig was designed, I held it like this, and just took off just like a hair of my skin. But I turned all the rest of my hair gray because like, oh my gosh, I could have just cut my thumb if it was like not this small little jig. So anyway, that scared me. So I'm back to being really careful about it. And my new cabinet saw has all the safety stuff, like so I leave those on there unless I have to take them off.
All table saws should have a time limit and just shut themselves off after like 4 hours of work.
Right, you're just like, you're done. There's no way that yeah, that's a good point. A lot of building a house involves heights. You can't get away from it. Here I am, I'm balancing on joists on our back porch. And sometimes it's higher heights. Here we are in some makeshift scaffolding. And sometimes it's even higher heights. Here we are on a ladder on the makeshift scaffolding to get all the way to the peak of this 14-foot tall thing. But we didn't have any fall. There's my wife out on the cantilevered edge of this scaffolding that we made. And my son got involved with the high heights. So here we were building the barn, and to do the roofing, it wasn't really clear how you get up to do the peak of the roof on that, So I built my own makeshift scaffolding with 2x4s, which I thought was pretty cool. It made it like a ladder. It was pretty stable, but my son said it was the scariest thing he ever did, and he's never going to work on a roof again. That's him up there at the top, learning a little courage. And lots of ladders. So here's my wife on a ladder. And I got to tell you about how are we doing on time? Okay. Our general contractor was actually a close friend named Scott Guthridge, and he was a developer. He'd take land and he'd build 30 houses and sell the houses off, right? But he decided that he wanted to slow down from that and become an inspector, and we ran into this problem where we wanted to be our own general contractors, but that just wasn't going to work because the bank wouldn't give a loan if you're your own general contractor, and half the subcontractors wouldn't work for a homeowner. So we hired him. And his backstory was that he was working in one of those 2-story high foyers, working on some lighting or something up top, and the ladder slipped and he fell down, 1.5 stories, and shattered his tibia and fibula. And he walks around with metal inside the tibia to this day. So he was really cautious about ladders. And he saw my wife once and nearly had a heart attack himself because she was on the roof, on a ladder on the roof, working on something, and the ladder slid out, down and off the roof. and she just dropped onto this slanted roof and stuck the landing like Mary Lou Retton. It was amazing, but it freaked him out, and it freaked me out too when I found out. I'm like, what were you doing? But fortunately, she did okay. But we do have a ladder story coming up. So we were finishing up the drywalling and stuff inside the house in the winter, and it was cold. So we had to put these temporary things over here and run heaters in the garage because we were drywalling the garage and it had to be a certain temperature. And it was icy outside. So our general contractor went into the garage to put, a few pieces of blocking in. So he had to be on this relatively short step ladder, but he'd been outside and there were ice on his boots. And he had the tip of his Phillips screwdriver was, cammed out a little bit, and he should have gotten a new tip. And so he's standing up on this short step ladder, pushing in at the top, and with the pushing and the ice, his legs slipped out. And he went with his legs bent straight down and crushed his femur into the concrete. And actually, so I said we have a pretty good house, very well insulated house. The walls are like 12 inches thick, full of insulation, foam on the outside. So it also makes it pretty soundproof. So he was in the garage screaming for half an hour, and nobody could hear him. So this is his x-ray, and you can see, I don't know if you have any medical experience, but essentially this should line up with that, not be bent 80 degrees with a shard almost pushing through the skin there. So that was, and here's his old injury. That's actually the first one he had, same leg. So here it is after they fixed it and made it straight. Got several screws in there and a big old rod. And so as a consequence, now he's completely petrified of ladders. So his goal was to be an inspector. Well, I don't know if you know anything about inspection, but kind of have to be on ladders constantly. So he's like, I can't keep doing this job. What can I do? And what do you think he asked God? What all of us ask God when something inconceivably terrible happens. Why? You can't help but ask it. Maybe even we think theologically we shouldn't ask why. So why? So how would you guys counsel Scott about this inconceivably bad hardship that he experienced for no reason? It's not just a theoretical question, because I went and saw him in the hospital afterwards thinking, what am I going to say to this guy? He was tired of the hospital food, so I went to the Belvedere Inn and snuck him in some good food. I wore my white coat and just so nobody stopped me. I brought you some food. So what would you say? You were going to say something, G.
Well, I know for myself that most of my injuries are because I don't delegate enough, and so I need to slow down and delegate and not do so much physical. So for me, for him, would be maybe you should take more of the GC position where he's not getting so involved, but he's still managing the projects. So he can keep his job, is what he enjoys doing, but not doing the physical part.
Yeah. So to his response, because when you ask why, you're almost sort of asking, how should I respond to this? You'd say, maybe it's a signal he needs to get less into the physical and more into the mental aspects of his job. Okay. What else? I'm sure there's a million things we can say, and it's okay to be wrong. It will be instructive even if you say something later you think, I should have said it that way. What kinds of things could you say?
I feel like we're wired to have a solution for people. We want to give people solution. At least I do. And a lot of people, I think, want to give friends and family and loved ones solutions when they're having problems. But sometimes, how can we know why? I don't know why. He's asking why. I don't know why. There's a reason. A door closes, another one opens. That's a platitude that people love to hear when they're going through hardship. But, just encouraging prayer and saying, ask why, ask now what? Where do I go from here? Because me as an outsider looking in, I might have an idea of why, but I could be completely wrong because I'm not God. I don't know why.
So you wouldn't answer the question why is one thing here he's saying.
Yeah. maybe just give encouragement to stay on a wise path of like, don't ask why, like, why did you do this to me? Ask, why did this happen, now what? Now where do I go?
So
Like,
now what
keep
is a
depending-
better question?
Well, in my mind, yes, because I have the attitude of my perspective, but like your perspective of how you're asking why matters. Like when my 10-year-old is like, why are you doing this to me? As opposed to being like, well, why does this keep me safe? Or why does, like, what is your reasoning behind this?
Right.
Not just an
The
automatic.
first why is really just saying, I'm ticked.
Yeah,
This,
yeah, like helping a friend come out of the initial like, this is how my life was supposed to go and it's not. And keeping them from going down the path of anger and, fighting
So
against
should we
reality.
rebuke him for being mad and asking why in
No,
anger?
I hope I didn't come across as that, like, help to guide a person a certain way with compassion, and like, yeah, this sucks. So now what, like, let's ask God for wisdom and guidance, and where do we go from here, and, yeah. Yeah, no, rebuking, that's not.
I think the other thing to emphasize on is a lot of time things happen for a reason, so you can use the story to share with others. So it's not to keep for yourself. Although you're going through it, it's for you, because you will eventually in time be across somebody, maybe not 100% the same injury or family issues or whatever, but you go through something that you can still share your faith and gospel through to use for others later. And so asking why would be, well, God's given you a story to use, so use it, would be, another aspect to it.
Sometimes I think too, it's a good reminder, like, I'm not God, you're not God, because a lot of people say, well, I think I should do this, and they take their own mind and instead of saying, maybe you should ask God, and I don't know what God's telling you, but you know your job, you know your body, ask God what he wants and just remind them.
Yeah, very often we feel like we know how the story ought to go. We may not even say it that way, because as soon as we say it that way, of course, we realize, oh, well, maybe we don't. But we don't say it out loud, it's just in there, So something's unfair because it's not going the way we imagined it. And by the way, I asked you some tough questions. I wasn't trying to say your line of thinking was bad. I thought it was really good, so I wanted to push it with some questions. I heard you say something we didn't comment on, which you say, yeah, this sucks, which would be empathy, right? So empathy is part of the response too. So.
But if you take time and wait, you'll see what God wants you to do. Maybe by time he heals more, he'll see that God wants him to do something else that's totally different even, or a family member who needs more help or something that he can help with or whatever. You just don't know. I mean, I retired 1.5 years ago, and it was because of situations at work and stuff with my knees. But then I ended up babysitting my great-grandson for my granddaughter because she needed a babysitter, and he's 2 now. So I've been watching him for 1.5 years because she didn't have anyone, and it's hard to find good sitters, so I have him. She can rely on me, for her job. So you never know what's gonna happen. You have to wait and see, you just have to have faith God's gonna take care of it.
So there's an element of time where patients are waiting. So how much time between your various responses?
He's got a long healing time there, so he can't do anything anyway.
You don't have to do all the responses at once, though.
I mean, it takes time. You can't just jump the gun and say, I'm gonna do this tomorrow, it takes time.
Yeah.
It comes down to your perspective, and when you look at Joe and what he went through and all of his friends that came in and started giving all their opinions, and sometimes you just need to sit back and listen. We get our thought process so congested with what we think should be occurring and what we want to do and how the outcome should be to us, when we don't take the time to listen and allow God to work in us and through some people around us at times. You don't want to hear what somebody might want to say to you. I know our son has said that numerous times with his journey. People always tell him, God might have a plan for this or that, and you never know that he's setting you up. Like I think somebody said it, the situation you're going through that might speak to somebody else down the road. That God already knows that they're going to be going through this trial, and they're building you up, or he's building you up to be there for somebody else. We just never know, and our thought process a lot of times gets in the way of that.
Sounds like you've worked with people who've experienced hardships.
Once or twice.
Yeah. I think there is. I think all those responses are right, and I think timing is crucial. And I think that one way to put this in a framework is to think about grief. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, that grief tends to have several different sort of stages you go through, not necessarily in a rigid order, but anger, denial, bargaining, and the last stage is acceptance. And I feel like we as people who are theologically oriented want to ask the question, well, what does the acceptance stage look like? Which might be that wisdom of saying maybe God's redirecting us, maybe this is a story to share for other people, right? But from the human factor, what might seem cold sometimes is that we ask somebody to be so mature spiritually that they skip all the normal human emotions of grief and get straight to the acceptance. And I feel like that's why sometimes it seems so awkward or even painful when somebody has a hardship, because we as Christians know what acceptance ought to look like, but we may try to push them there so fast they don't have time to just be human and have those emotions. And I think one thing that helps us believe that's okay is the Psalms. One of the reasons the Psalms is there is to show having those raw human emotions and going through grief in times of trouble is okay. And often at the ends of those Psalms, they come to a place of acceptance. But, oh Lord, you have your way. But the first 14 verses out of 16 are all about the emotions and the grief and the anger. And I think that that's something that, like you said, you get time. That we got to give some time for us to have empathy, to be there for their anger, to be there for their denial. And but then ultimately, we do have the wisdom to share about it in that stage of acceptance. So here's some takeaways that Scott gave me. So this is not, I just took him out to lunch and I said, Scott, you want to reflect with me? I'm talking about this. And he gave permission to tell his story. I said, how did you handle this? What did your acceptance look like? So here's some things he said. He said one thing he heard pretty strongly was look for the new opportunity, right? You're saying, right? Maybe there's a better thing I'm supposed to be doing with my time than climbing ladders, right? And actually it did. It forced him to pursue his love of baking. I didn't make a big deal of this, but he was constantly bringing us bread and pizza and cakes. He made my 50th birthday cake because during COVID I couldn't have a party, so he brought it to that. And so he actually opened up Scott's Artisan Pizza in response to this.
Wow.
Tough times make the best stories, he said. Right? And somebody said about it, maybe you have a story to tell, which is true, right? We remember the things that went wrong in our wedding, right? Those are the guffaws that we share later. Oh gosh, you remember, we forgot the flowers, whatever. See?
I didn't forget my flowers.
I just randomly picked that story, but maybe the victory is for the next generation, he said, because he's got adult kids that are just barely adults. And he got to talk about this with them. He said, maybe the victory is for the next generation. We might have tough times, but they learn from our tough times, and maybe they'll have an even better time than us because they get to learn with us. He said it drove him to memorize scripture to overcome his discouragement. And it allowed him to exemplify character to his children, to see what it looks like to suffer and not lose your faith. And so I'm going to end just by a couple of quotes from some people who've thought deeply about suffering, and then my favorite scripture about suffering. Many of you recognize this man, C.S. Lewis. And he said this about suffering, that God whispers to us in our pleasures, right? When things are going good and we're praising God. But he shouts in our pains. Pain is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world, right? So sometimes we aren't going to make that change we need to make until we go through some pain. It's just the way we are. And so instead of despising pain, to interpret it as the wake-up call we needed is sometimes the right acceptance to get to. Tim Keller, God rest his soul, he said this: Christianity teaches that, contra fatalism, suffering is overwhelming. Fatalism is like, I just accept it, it's got to happen. It's like, no, don't, like we talked about, don't rush them past their grief, right? Suffering is overwhelming. It is hard. That is why we call it suffering. So don't pretend it's no big deal. Contra Buddhism, suffering is real, right? Life is not an illusion. Contra karma, suffering is often unfair, right? We learned that from Job, right? You don't just look at somebody's suffering and say, well, I guess you messed up in proportion to the amount of suffering you have. Contra secularism, suffering is meaningful. And that is probably the biggest one that we fight nowadays, right? Is that people like, suffering is meaningless, you need to avoid it at all costs. Well, that is not our perspective. Instead, he says, there is a purpose to suffering, and if you face it rightly, it can drive us like a nail deep into the love of God and into more stability and spiritual power than you can imagine. Right? So Christians do not just despise suffering. We see it as meaningful, and we look for that meaning. So if you wouldn't mind, and I guess I can't look it up because my phone's recording. So Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 to 13. I would like to end with this set of scriptures, which since I was a teenager has been the verse I always think about when I go through suffering.
What verses?
Verses 7 to 13.
Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed.
So when discipline comes my way, I should see it as the love of God, of a Father who sees hope in me, sees me being holy like he's holy, sees me being as someone who can be involved in his healing of the world. Suffering is meaningful because it's this hardship, it's the discipline of a Father who loves me. And I hope that thought carries you through your next bit of suffering as well. So we pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the exceedingly great love you showed us by sending Jesus Christ to suffer for us, to rescue us, and to show us the way that there is meaning in suffering and its redemption of the world. And help us to be part of that redemption, even though it costs being part of the suffering. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.